It's a pleasure to be here. There are some pretty amazing opportunities for technical innovation to more influence the mature and traditional industries in energy, including oil and gas, including established utilities. And these two worlds that I have the pleasure of living a little bit in each are really, they're really far apart in how they communicate and how they can relate to one another. So that's going to be the topic of tonight, is how can we transform the way that these two industries work together in a way that can expedite innovation and in fact inform innovation going forward. So it's always a pleasure to be back on campus. Not only was I an Earth Systems graduate, I was in the first Earth Systems class, and I also spent many hours on Robley Field playing ultimate frisbee. So it's always nice to come back here. And I'm going to think back even a little farther to that, and I'm going to start this talk with when my best friend and I were preparing for middle school. Then we called it junior high. And we got together and we wanted to make our junior high lockers a place of refuge and solace. So we colored pictures of unicorns and rainbows, and you can imagine our image of what it was going to be like when we walked through those middle school doors and made it to our lockers. And instead, we found that this was really a more appropriate decoration for a locker. So we had a shock to the system. We had some growing up to do, and we could have used a little help translating this new world that we found ourselves in. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to be talking about translating a little bit. I have the good fortune to spend time here as the strategic advisor to the Natural Gas Initiative. As John mentioned, one of my great passions is energy development and access. So getting energy to people in the developing world, and we just did a symposium here on that in May. I also have a couple startups that I consult to who are in the Bay Area. I'm not an expert on startups. No one could ever sit in this neck of the woods and claim that. But I've spent enough time there to at least know some things that can go terribly wrong when you're trying to sell into established industries. And so my consultancy, we spend most of our time actually consulting to the oil and gas industry and traditional utilities, mostly focused on natural gas. And so I have a real familiarity and comfort with those sectors. But all of our work is about helping them be the best they can be. So there's a lot of opportunity to engage tech, and we'll talk about that throughout the next 50 minutes. So this is the maiden voyage of this talk. So I have strived to balance between providing a lot of general information, like in just a second I'll tell you about what it's like to be the CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, but then also to provide tidbits that will be immediately relevant to people working in tech that want to sell into the oil and gas space. And so if I fail to navigate that land between generalities and specificity, I hope that you'll be acquiring questions. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time and leave ample time for Q&A at the end. So I hope you'll guide me to make sure that when you leave here, we've worked together to ensure you have some really interesting and useful information on the other side. Okay, so I used to head COGA, and what that means is if you run a trade association is that you're the face of the industry in the state. It is not comfortable to be an environmentalist living in Boulder and be the face of an oil and gas trade association in Colorado. It'd be kind of like doing that right here. So you can imagine the tensions. But I went into it because I believed I could help the industry be better, but I also believed that a lot of really important energy and environmental solutions could come out of the oil and gas industry. So as a result, I found myself sitting in this corner office, this beautiful corner office. It's the Colorado Capitol behind it. I found myself sitting in this office taking meetings from all kinds of people who were inventors and had startups and had new solutions, and they wanted access to the oil and gas industry. And because I ran this association that provided the interface between the industry and the rest of the state. There was lots of opportunities. We had lunch and learns where tech companies could provide information. We did round tables where on a specific topic where companies could come together. So I had a lot of opportunity to see what it was like between the innovators and the industry. And I'm just going to start here with the story of one, because it will set up in a lot of ways what I'm hoping that we can talk about tonight. So a guy came in, and he had invented a technology to filter out a specific contaminant from produced water. So produced water is the water that comes back to the surface from an oil and gas well. And he was very proud of this. He explained it at great length to me, all about what it can do. And he said, I've tested it in the lab. I want to test it in the field. I need a company to test this with. So that seems reasonable enough, except I wasn't quite sure where to start. I wasn't familiar with the problem he talked about. So I said, which basin has this contaminant? So Colorado has dozens of different oil and gas basins. That's the geographic area where you produce oil and gas. Which basin has this problem? And he said, I don't know. Okay. Which companies have this problem? There were 50 oil and gas companies, 20 pretty big ones, 8 that really mattered. Which company has this problem? I don't know. Do we actually have this contaminant in Colorado? I don't know. Right, you get the picture. So here we are, but this is actually perhaps more common than you might think. We have a solution in search of a problem. And that is, in fact, a lot of what happens when companies are coming into established traditional industries. They're bringing their solution, and they're looking for the problem to fit it with. So if you are a startup or an MBA or an inventor, this is how we like to think of ourselves. So what we all like to think of, like a cool office, interesting people, smart, at the cutting edge of something, probably a pinball machine, somewhere in the perimeter of what's happening. So this is how we like to think of it. But if you approach an established industry that has been around for 100 years with a solution to a problem that they don't have or don't know they have, they're going to think of you as the cheesiest salesman that exists. So this is really important. The approach matters. So I think the first thing for us to contemplate is let's avoid that, right? Like that's not what we want to do, but that is actually a pretty well-trod path to come into a company with a solution. So what I'd like to suggest instead is that we think about, and this talk is really focused on tech. There's a little bit on what I tell oil and gas companies when they're innovating, but it's really more because of where we're sitting today. It's more about how do you approach a traditional industry with something from a perspective that they're going to be able to hear you. Okay. So let me tell you, just back up for a moment, tell you a little bit about what I mean by oil and gas, because it's not always known. And then I'll talk a little bit about tech. Okay, so you can't see this, and it's okay. You don't have to. Essentially, the oil and gas industry is a very diverse, complicated industry that operates all over the world. The thing that you need to know for the sake of this discussion is there's a resource, generally oil or gas or a mix of both. It's brought to the surface, that's exploration and production. It's brought to some central processing facility, that's gathering. It's then piped to some other central facility for either refining or distribution, and then it goes out into the marketplace as a whole variety of products that become everything that we're leaning on, sitting on, standing on, typing on in this room. So petroleum products all over the place. Further, I'll talk a little bit about, and if there's specific questions, I'm happy to talk about gas utilities, because in the context of this discussion, there are actually enough similarities that they're relevant. So gas utilities take natural gas from a central location and then take it out to customers. So if you like to cook on a gas stove, that's how it gets into your house. Perhaps you're a hot water heater. by gas. And then at industrial facilities, gas is a feedstock for tons of other things. So those are two, for the sake of this talk, we'll talk about oil and gas utilities as industries that have been around generally for 50 or 100 years, more or less. They have established hierarchies for the most part. People spend their career working and they work their way up. So by the time you get to a decision maker, they have a long career history generally, and they have a lot of expectations about how things are done. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what I mean by tech in this context. Simply, I just mean any inventor, any startup, anybody with a new idea that wants to take it out into the marketplace. So very broad definition. There's a lot of things that I'll mention that we can talk about in the context of how do oil and gas and tech interface. We could have a whole talk on all the ways they could interface, but just for grounding purposes, for the purpose of this talk, I'll mention a few. The first is if you think about oil and gas drilling, generally speaking, you're going a mile down, or in some cases 10 miles down, then you may make a right-hand turn and go 1 to 2 miles or farther horizontally. So oil and gas drilling is really the rocket science of the subsurface. The quantities of data available in this industry are remarkable. The software processing needs and capabilities are enormous, and so there's a lot of need and interface around software and data, never mind everything you can imagine around security in those contexts. So that's one area. A second area is reducing emissions. So in oil and gas, just to name two areas, very clearly you have water that comes up with oil and gas, produced water, removing contaminants from that allow you to recycle it or dispose of it in some way safely. That's a whole area with a lot of innovation, a lot of tech, a lot of solutions. Another one is air emissions. When you're running engines, when you're producing oil and gas, you have air emissions. So all kinds of innovation around the different air the different arenas around air emissions. In fact, the Natural Gas Initiative has a whole focus just on methane emissions and oil and gas. So that's a huge business area in and of itself. In a little bit, I'll mention a company I work with that focuses specifically on that. The third is business models. This is actually a really interesting component of the energy poverty work I do. So for example, in the developing world where people can't afford huge amounts of infrastructure to transition, say, from burning charcoal to burning propane, innovative business models are things like people getting a canister of propane and having a pay-as-you-go model. So some kind of digital payment method where they can pay in short bursts as they can afford it. So a kind of innovation that makes transformation of energy access possible. So that's an example. A different business innovation is a company I'll talk about in a little bit where they do third-party ratings of oil and gas operations. So they're bringing in the idea of a third-party evaluation of operations, a different kind of business model innovation to transform the way companies think about risk. And then the last one is just traditional use of solar. So in Colorado, the #1 purchaser of solar panels is the oil and gas industry. Every single well has one or more solar panels. In fact, theft is actually a big challenge because all of the information they collect on site is relayed wirelessly, and so they have to have a small amount of local power. So just a few examples there of how those things can work together. So we'll spend the rest of the time talking about how the translation can happen. And in particular, these very different worlds can uncomfortably collaborate and get along. So it is possible. I'm seeing it happen every day. Okay, so let's focus on tech. So what I'd like to spend the majority of the rest of our time on now, we have about 20 more minutes for the talk, is what do you need to know if you have a company or an innovation you want to sell into a traditional field? I suspect this would translate to a lot of traditional fields. My experience is limited to oil and gas and natural gas utilities. But I think there's a few things that you can know. So the first is that the oil and gas and utility businesses are relationship businesses. I think everything fundamentally is a relationship business at the end of the day, but these are much more traditional environments. And so the sales cycle is very long, often several years, because essentially not only do you have to make contact, you have to cultivate a champion within a company who's willing to stand up for the innovation and champion it up the chain of command until you get approval to start it and try something new. So very long lead times, very long sales cycle, and that can be difficult if there's a lot of impatient capital or if you want to have a really quick pilot program. But those are important things to know. The second thing is it's not about the money. So generally, I find people say the oil and gas industry has more money than God, which is mostly true. I don't know how much money God has, but because they have a lot of money. But the scale of the industry is so extraordinary that actually most companies are operating, averaging on a, say, a 5 or 10 year cycle, around a 5% profit margin. And now that the price of oil, if you've been enjoying depressed prices of oil and depressed prices of natural gas now for quite some time, has led this industry to relish every form of efficiency. And essentially now drilling operations are considered factory-like operations that have to become so streamlined, so efficient that every little price is, every little dollar is squeezed out of it. So companies that think, oh, this is an industry with so much money are looking at it the wrong way. However, the advantage is any innovation that can bring increased efficiency and reduce cost by increasing efficiency is going to have an audience and is going to discriminate themselves from their competition. Okay, so what this means is that the onus of understanding the companies, the industry that you want to work into is really on the startup. And this is very challenging because startups are already usually somewhere, they're ambitious and they're cash strapped regardless of how many millions they have. They have less millions than they wish they had for all the things that they want to do. And setting aside a budget to understand your industry is actually really important. And there's a few ways that you can do this. So the first is to hire someone who knows the industry, straight up, a consultant. That's actually how I end up introduced to most of the people and companies I work with, is they just want translation, they want help articulating their problem, they want to make introductions. The second is just straight up informational interviews, the same kind of practice that you have when you want to go out and network into a job or into a new business area. Informational interviews, I have found that traditional industries can be very generous with their time. They want to be associated with tech and innovation. They want to have ties to places like Stanford and Silicon Valley. And people tend, as individuals, to be very generous with their time to sit down and provide a lot of information privately. One hint, although you know how you can help them, strive to never tell them. Because nobody likes, if you think about if you're going to go buy a car and someone comes right up to you and they say, I know what car you want. There's generally nothing absolutely more irritating than that. And yet somehow almost everyone approaches the industry, and I had this experience as the CEO of COGA for 5 years, so I know it well, of what you need to do is, or if you only, ... So this is really a flipping of perspective to say, tell me about the things that aren't working for you. In this area of water, say water cleanup, for example, tell me what are the problems that you're having trouble solving? What are the things that you can't do? How are you dealing with them now? Because the innovation may be technology, but it may be a business model, it may be an iterative cycle of some kind, but you won't know the approach to make until you know more about the business. Okay, Last thing to know about the oil and gas industry, well, there's about 10,000 things you need to know about the oil and gas industry, but the last thing you need to know at this moment is they are under siege from smart innovators. So it's kind of hard to imagine because we all want to be the unique solution to whatever. But if you are in the industry in some area, say methane detections technology, you field 5 calls a week from someone with an invention, an idea, a new. And so figuring out a way to articulate more of a long-term plan, which we'll talk about in just a minute, is really important to separate the 90 people with a good idea from the 1 or 2 people with a business plan that's going to result in a long-term industry partnership. Okay, so one example, one of the companies I consult to, I mentioned IES. Their CEO, Jory Calkins, Stanford MBA. They do third-party ratings of oil and gas operations, so they understand risk, and they help provide external perspective that can be then communicated to investors or shareholders, things like that. Here's the interesting thing. Based in San Francisco, have a whole team of amazing crack software and data people. What they did was develop a petroleum engineering group based in Houston, all with people who've spent 10 to 30 years in the oil and gas industry. This is absolutely the thing that has made them essentially peerless and competitorless, is that they really got to know the industry, and it started with one person, and now they have a whole group there. The second thing they did is turn one of their groups in San Francisco into customer experience to understand how the industry is using the data. It's not how they expected, and basically create feedback loops with them to make that data more interesting and relevant to them so that they further embed and become relevant to their operations. All right. So the nice thing, though, as much as it's important to understand the industry, is that established natural gas utilities, for example, don't want people coming in who look and sound like them. They have a lot of those people around them. They're old, established industries. They're interested to meet and spend time with startups. So you don't have to know everything. Do I have a funny message at the top? Oh, low battery. Okay, I'll talk faster. How many minutes do you think that gives me? Okay. All right, I'll talk kind of faster. Thanks for the warning. The little thing I couldn't read. Okay, so it behooves you to understand the industry, but it is not necessary that you be one of them. They want you to be who you are and query them for the important information that you want to know. There is no scenario you can convince them that you know more about their business than they do. You would be amazed how many young, recent MBA grads I have seen try to do this. It is not necessary. You go in, you ask questions, you be yourself, you bring the gifts that you have into that meeting. So one of my clients also here locally, these guys are in Mountain View. They do aerial methane emissions, so planes with sensors flying methane. And their CEO, Steve Diker, they also have Stanford MBAs on their team as well. I guess it's inevitable. Their CEO, I've taken him into many oil and gas meetings, and they always start off really tense because those guys are just cranky because they have so many of these meetings. So they always start off kind of tense. And Steve usually says, I'm not an oil and gas expert. I'm an astrophysicist. And like, you really can't say that without looking and sounding like a geek, and that's exactly how it is. And it completely melts the tension in the room because they go, oh, good, he's an astrophysicist. Like, that's cool, he's an astrophysicist. I'm a geologist or petroleum engineer. And then we have a conversation about people, about their areas of expertise. So I have seen that be a very important bridge in bringing these worlds together. Okay, so I thought it might be useful. Get it hitched up, take a moment and hitch. Okay. You've already seen the only 2 words I have in the slide, so there's not like any actual information in here for you. There's just entertainment value. How'd I do? Seems to be working? Okay, excellent. I didn't say I was high tech. I think that much has become abundantly clear. Okay. So, oh, I thought it'd be useful if I spent just a couple moments telling you about how I advise oil and gas companies so that you know what it looks like a little bit on the other side before you go into that space. So I already mentioned it's very, 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 very crowded, like 100,000 times more crowded than you ever imagined. And if you're gonna go talk to oil and gas employees at a conference, just know you're not the only one. It's a crowded space. And so the first thing I advise them to do if they're going to have some kind of process to engage industries to think about how they're going to filter. So companies work in a few ways. Some have R&D departments, which is best case scenario, really, because then you have the people whose job it is to go out and meet you and filter you. But more often, there's just people whose job is environmental health and safety, and they have to deal with trying to keep up with tech on the side. And it's just an overwhelming component of their job. So you have both of those. Some companies have innovative grants and things like that, so they'll take applications and they do that cyclically. Those kind of things are I think, ideal as well. But they're gonna filter you, so you have to approach a company with a very clear understanding of how you discern yourself from either your competitors or just from tech or people in that space in general. So that's a first step. The second is that there's gonna be this long iteration if a company starts working with a startup, an established company works with a startup. So if you were imagining perhaps that you would go in and make $1 million sale, it almost never works like that. There's some form of pilot project, and then post-pilot project, there's iterations into slowly expanding phases. Because usually what's happening is you're working your way up the chain of approval till you have some project that's of relevant size. So here's a few things that I tell companies to think about. Does this company have backing, real backing? Will they be here in a year? Because a company it's a huge investment on the part of the utility, for example, on the staff, if that company's not gonna be around. Do they have a fee model that's gonna work? So are they getting paid enough? So even though you don't have to make money because you have investors, if you don't have a revenue model that's relevant, actually the oil and gas companies are very, very attuned to this. And so they wanna see that you're actually charging an amount that's gonna keep you in business for the duration. And then the last thing is you actually have to like each other. You don't have to be the same, you're not gonna be the same, but you have to develop a rapport, which comes back to the beginning of this, of it's a relationship business. Because it's actually quite stressful for an established industry to test something new. They're having to report back, they're spending money, they're a little pilot project. So internally, your rep, your internal champion, is taking a lot of risks. So it's stressful, and they're gonna be iterating with you to get something that they can take to their senior vice president or the company CEO, ultimately, hopefully the board, to demonstrate that this little crazy idea of theirs was genius. So relationships, in the end, are king, because you're gonna make a ton of mistakes, and if you have the rapport to get through them, then it's gonna go a lot better. Okay, 4 minutes, but plenty of battery. Okay. So just to recap a few things that I talked about in the broad context of both the tech companies and the traditional industries. The first thing that I've beaten to death is that this is ultimately going to be about relationships. If you think it's about your tech, if you think it's about data, if you think it's about software, if you say things like scalable, model to infinite revenue, nobody cares. Ultimately, someone within a company is going to take a chance on you, and you're going to have to stick with them until together you're successful. The second thing is that the burden of understanding the industry you're selling into is on the startup. It's really, really, really important. When you're figuring out what you're investing in, you invest in understanding the industry. Understand the language, understand how they think about things, understand how they make money, understand their problems, and understand if you're solving them. And if you're not solving a problem that exists, it's going to be really hard to find anyone interested in you. The third is that there's tons of iterations happening on both sides of this. So this is a real investment for the long haul. So a lot of times when we think about the way startups phase from their seed to their first round to their, we think about projects and revenue and these big chunks as if they happen miraculously, like bacteria that have been fed and are growing. But in reality, these are very conscious iterations, making improvements, understanding more, and coming back to the next phase. That's the only way that you're ultimately going to get embedded. You could do 100 pilots, and if nobody signs up for the next project, you will not have a business in a year. So figuring out how to embed in a way that you become a part of their identity is ultimately what's going to lead to success. This is possible. I have seen it happen. I have seen strange beasts get along for the duration. And so with that, I will take your questions. Thank you. All right, bring it on. What do we got?
So I'm sure a big part of the oil and gas industry right now is looking at new up-and-coming energy sources. I'm curious how startups in, say, like the renewable sector are coming in and having these same kind of discussions with oil companies and what that relationship looks like.
So it's interesting in my experience. So the question is, how are oil and gas companies looking at renewables, for example? So it's my experience that industry is actually one of the largest R&D investors in probably the world. I don't know this definitively, but my experience, particularly with the global majors, the BPs, the Exxons, the Totals, the Shells, these are companies that have huge divisions investing in R&D, both directly and indirectly, and making acquisitions and things like that. So, and then they have usually, in fact, at one time, Shell had the largest wind farm in the country, operated the largest wind farm in the country. I don't know if that's still true. So, but to your question, if you were a new energy startup, and you wanted to sell into oil and gas, you would have to figure out what problem they're trying to solve, not what answer you had. And so those conversations in terms of where they're going with their innovation are very complicated, and they're many generations ahead of my thinking, certainly, and what's coming next. So the approach, I think, is more about understanding what they have going on, as opposed to what they need, and therefore what they need.
Other questions?
What sort of problems typically are most pressing that they're looking for outside help in solving?
So big opportunities around meeting regulatory requirements. So we're in a new day. We don't know what will happen to, for example, federal regulatory requirements. But in the Obama and anticipated Clinton administration, driving methane regulations and what those ultimately would require became the most pressing problem of environmental health and safety departments all over the country. And this is where policy really matters. Just to switch gears for just a second. In Colorado, we have rules for leak detection and repair. So this is testing your methane leaks and then ultimately repairing them, that require new technologies to be approved by the state, which really slows down innovation. And there's actually a rulemaking underway in Colorado right now to expedite the way that technological solutions can be adopted into regulation. EPA is notorious for naming very isolated solutions that actually limit innovation and limit our ability to solve problems. And so having flexible policy in this day and age is going to be a really driving consideration. But methane regs are a great example of something that dominated the landscape for the last several years.
Other questions? Well, I had one. You've done a great job kind of on the context for all the things you do, including just now the shale gas boom balancing of different forces. If you would, I don't know if you're willing to do this, you don't have to mention names. Could you give us an example of like your biggest success as a consultant and or as a COGA person, biggest success and most abysmal failure? Probably you don't want to give names and numbers for the failures, huh?
Sure. Yeah, actually, thank you for the opportunity. So my greatest success when I was the CEO of COGA, we passed 5 national precedent-setting regulations. So Colorado had the strictest regulations in the country, but with industry support. So that's kind of unheard of. Usually it's a battle of the forces, and industry was willing to say, a lot of times in Colorado, we would say, welcome to Colorado. Like if you're a Texas company, welcome to Colorado. Now we have the most stringent regulations in the country. And that's what it's going to take to operate here. And we were proud of that. And I enjoyed leading an association during times like that. I think the great crown of that achievement was that Colorado passed the first and only methane regulations in the country. They're not ideal, as I just mentioned. The devil is so in the details, and you learn as you go. But Colorado has very progressive and thoughtful regulations around methane emissions, and they were passed with industry support, so I enjoy that. My most abysmal failure was also a success, but early in my COGA tenure, so I'm a geologist, and I was super interested, you can imagine, in a world where talking about fracking dominates your life 24/7. In Colorado, we had one basin that every well required before and during and after drilling sampling. So we had 10 years of data in one basin. So I could go and show this data, and it was a very shallow basin. So I could say we have thousands of wells, we have tens of thousands of data points, and we can demonstrate that we haven't contaminated groundwater in this basin. And people would say, that's great, but what about my basin or my part of the state? So we did a voluntary baseline groundwater sampling program, got 98% of all operators to join voluntarily. We did pre, during, and post groundwater sampling of all new wells in Colorado, later supported it becoming a mandatory requirement. And so that was a huge success. The bad side was that there was not one good press story about it. It just was like, it passed. Bloop. So I worked on it for 3 years, and then it passed. Bloop. And then the next day we went back to whatever controversy we had. So.
Great. Oh, now we have a lot more questions. Open up. Let's go way in the back and then try to fit in the other 3 here. You all get in. Yes, ma'am.
What oil and gas companies, in your opinion, are at the forefront of innovation currently?
Good question.
What companies are at the forefront? Yeah, so you can look at the list of Natural Gas Initiative members, and this isn't just a plug for them, but the Natural Gas Initiative members are truly at the forefront. So ExxonMobil has a huge R&D center. They have a really thoughtful team that focuses on climate change that I work with. They have some really cool stuff going on. Shell has an entire division focused on the next generation of energy innovation. That when their VP or SVP or EVP or some kind of EVP spoke at our Reducing Energy Poverty Symposium, I was captivated by everything he said was about to happen to the energy future, but I understood almost none of it. So they're so amazing and ahead that I have no idea what's going on, so I can't tell you about it. But those are a couple examples of companies.
So the Natural Gas Initiative is a Precourt Institute initiative here at Stanford. Brad Ritz, who probably had another commitment because he and Tisha are preparing for the annual workshop for that group on Wednesday and Thursday, I think. So the website's pretty good. You could just look on that. And I do agree the sponsors are kind of self-selected in that regard. Yellow jacket in the back and then up here.
But like from the perspective of COGA, how do you feel about like Mountain West Transmission Group's like push to join the Southwest Power Pool in Colorado, like moving the Colorado electrical grid into a market versus like in that effect on the natural gas industry? I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts.
Awesome question. I have no idea. Not my area of expertise.
Fair enough.
Okay, up here.
Yeah, so you mentioned the need of having a champion in the company you're trying to sell. But what if also you have someone whose job is, someone who feels their job is being threatened by your technology? So what are
Always. That's such a great question. So such a good insight. So when you're selling into a company to solve a problem, you are threatening somebody because somebody is either not dealing with that problem or their job is made by that problem. So perfect example, the company Kairos could do methane detection by flights, but right now in Colorado, companies have invested millions. Every company has invested millions into a team of usually 3 or 4 people whose job it is to go around and spend the whole year looking for methane leak detections and fixing them. So if you had this much more efficient flight approach and then a targeted on-the-ground approach, you're going to be essentially upending these investments that the companies have made. The other thing is you're usually selling into the same department that is operating that solution, the current solution. So all I can say is this is about seeking to understand how the world looks from their perspective and see if you can't create it as a win for them. And that's all you can do. It is inherently threatening. Everything you people do is inherently threatening.
We have a couple
It's just
more
the
in
way
here.
it
I
is.
think
Yeah.
you were first and then 3. So we have 3 in here, right in here. You can go first.
You talked mainly about getting the first successful sale. Could you make a few quick comments about rate of diffusion across the whole industry once you've done that?
Oh, well, I hope to have that experience. I have not had it yet, but and when it does, I'll come back and talk again and tell you how it went. But so there is a tipping point that has to be met that is very challenging to get infiltration across the industry, particularly in an industry where there's going to be so much competition. So how do you make yourself not imitable by your competition is one of the challenges that you're always trying to iterate with. So the basic things that we've been trying to focus on is getting a critical mass of well-known names and champions. So essentially in the industry, although oil and gas companies, for example, are competitors, there's a pretty tight group in any specialty that talk, and so you can get a lot of referral business. And then ultimately, you have to inoculate yourself against the competitors because as soon as you have any success, there's someone right there imitating what you're doing cheaper, and you have to be iterating what you're doing better. So not a satisfying answer, but I'll be back with one.
Great, we have 2 up here, back here, and then up here for the last word.
Meeting regulatory requirements is one of the challenges to the industry. I'm wondering about federal versus state regulations and kind of how it exists now and what you might project is going to be happening with the changes taking place at the federal level.
Yeah. I'm not afraid to go on the record as saying I hope that we're not in a long time, we're not at the beginning of some kind of trend with this administration. But what we see in the oil and gas industry is the federal oversight is focused almost exclusively on federal lands. There are some exceptions, and then almost all regulation happens at the state. But if there is an overarching federal driver, for example in air, then it does have to be implemented at the state level, generally by state agencies. If I had to forecast, my crystal ball would say under any administration, that calculus will still stay the same. Federal lands, federal regulation, overarching minimal federal requirements, state requirements. Therefore, it's a pretty complex environment because regulations are driven by the state and it's very different state by state, very different. Even if they have equivalent regulations, for example, Pennsylvania and Colorado like to go neck and neck on who's the toughest state to do business in, but they're not compatible. So if you're working in 2 states, you need 2 different sets of people who understand those regs.
Wow. Last word here.
I had a question from the perspective of the inventor who was able to filter contamination from water, so they don't quite know their market yet. Mm-hmm. Thinking of the next steps of how do they balance talking to companies and being open to their ideas, but also advocating for the technology that they've developed?
Such a great question. So an inventor is in this really, and protect themselves so that their idea doesn't get scooped, right, by someone with more money or more resources. And so there's a very careful balance between advocating for yourself, protecting your IP, and getting the information you need to be successful. I think there's a little bit critical path in the sense that if you don't understand the problems your companies have, they're not gonna let you in the door. So you have to err on the side of oversharing to get a solid understanding. I think the best way to do that initially is a round of informational interviews. Just straight up network until you find someone who's willing to spend an hour with you and try to understand, and then see if they'll give you 3, just like when you're trying to get that first job. You get amazing insights very quickly, and even when I take on a new company, the first thing I do is spend 2 days on the phone, calling around saying, this is how it looks to me, is this how it looks to you? What do you think? Who should I talk to? Who are the experts in this? And you can actually work your way around pretty well. And as much as I've been a little overemphasizing the cranky nature of trying to break in, I will say that the traditional industries want to be associated with tech. So there's a sexy element to doing a demo project with a startup, if it's the right project and you're pretty darn sure it's going to be successful. So they're willing, they're interested, they'll give you a chance, they'll give you a lot of their time and energy and heart, as long as you're willing to meet them by doing your part of the work.
Great. With that, it looks like we're out of time. Thanks for a stimulating talk, and the audience for great questions.